we started playing around with what'll make it activate. And they said, well, think a bunch of neurotic thoughts. So I'm like, okay. So I start thinking a bunch of neurotic thoughts. I'm like, oh, they've seen a glioblastoma multiforme on my fMRI, but they're not telling me because they want to get really good scans. But when I come out of the scanner, they're going to tell me I have a terminal brain tumor and they should seek ontological care and start writing my will or whatever. And I'm like thinking these thoughts. And the PCC is really deactivating. And they were like, Daniel, are you thinking neurotic thoughts? I'm like, yeah, thinking pretty neurotic, paranoid thoughts. And they're like, well, it's not activating. It's staying inactive. What's wrong? And I was like, I don't know, maybe like, and I was like, oh, I'll bet I need to know what I need to think like I used to. And so, because I think thoughts in the room. So I'm sitting here and there's this like sense of like the colors of the monitor and the space and thoughts are arising of what I'm going to say, but I can see your eyes blinking and your smile. And like, there's this sense of presence to consensus space, even when thinking thoughts. And I said, oh, but I need to tune the room out. And so I started thinking the same neurotic thought pattern, but I just tuned the room out. And then the PCC really activated. And then it was like, okay, that's the thing.
Welcome to Living Mirrors with Dr. James Cook. My guest this week is Daniel Ingram. Daniel is a physician, meditator, and the author of the book Mastering the Core Teachings of the Buddha, as well as the book The Fire Kasina, co-authored with Shannon Stein. He's the co-founder of the Dharma Overground, an online community of meditation practitioners. He also founded the Emergent Phenomenology Research Consortium, an organization involved in promoting research into non-ordinary states of consciousness. He's well known in meditation circles for claiming to have achieved full enlightenment as a result of his meditation practice. Today, we discuss meditation, enlightenment, visionary states, reality, and how all this relates to science. Hope you enjoy the conversation. Okay, I'm here with Daniel Ingram. Daniel, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Yeah, great to be here.
So maybe we can begin with how you came to, if we start with the idea of kind of the self not being what it initially seems to be. My understanding from listening to other interviews you've done is that it was actually through reading about science that you first kind of went down this path. Is that right?
Yeah. So it was a book called The Dancing Woolly Masters that was recommended to me by my 8th or 9th grade science teacher. He was the same guy for 2 years in a row, so I can't remember which year it was. It was one of those 2 years. And I read it. And it's one of these, for those who haven't read it, it's by Gary Zukav. And it's a book of like new physics meets Zen consciousness kind of paradigms. And it's one of those early books. And it's great. It's a lot of fun. And it totally convinced me that something must be deeply wrong with my sense of how I perceive reality. And I was hooked. And yet I wasn't quite sure what to do about that. But it made its case that based on quantum mechanics, there are some assumptions. You've got to at least buy one of a few things, something about either superdeterminism or superluminal communication or something, right? Something additionally has to be happening here with quantum entanglement, or something related to the consciousness and the collapse of the wave function. And that was very compelling to me. And I thought, okay, I'm on board. I'm clearly delusional in thinking that I'm some sort of a separate, independent thing that relates to reality, but isn't actually of reality, isn't somehow causally, deterministically wrapped up in this whole interconnected process. And yet my experiences of separation, what the heck? And it took about another 10 years to really get the sense of what to do about that. But along those 10 years, I had a bunch of energetic and sort of what you might call spiritual, mystical, energetic, kundalini-ish, or whatever, pick your favorite term for the experiences, that also were doing something, I think, structural that really made me appreciate that there was something more to the possibility of the range of human experience, at least, if not one's ontological frames one might put on it. And yeah, so I was off and running, basically.
Right. So then when you turned to Buddhism, did you find that there was a kind of a correspondence between the scientific image of the universe as this lawful unfolding thing where it's not possible for you to really be separate from it and to be the kind of the prime mover, the cause of your own action? Was there some correspondence there?
Yeah, to put it gently, right? When I found, well, actually, like things that even began to crack the armor a little bit sooner were finding differential equations. And when I did a little bit of electrical engineering work as a second undergraduate degree that I was working on, didn't end up finishing because I decided to go off and become a meditator and medical public health something person. And so differential equations, actually, the sense of like this oscillation between potential and manifestation. When I saw that, like something in me just lit up. I felt like I was literally looking at the mathematics of God or something. Like, I don't mean to be too theological in that, but like something profound, something of like the deepest cosmic, okay, this is part of the solution. And so that sense of, when you do AC circuits and you're focusing on how things oscillate and impulse functions, and you're looking at this sort of, because that's electrical engineering, for alternating systems or changing systems is all about differential equations. And then they seem to be pointing to something that like something in some deep intuitive was like, okay, that's critical, something in this fluxiness, right? And then when I got to Buddhist meditation, I started going on retreats, and everything was becoming vibratory in some sort of wave particle energetic something in my experience, which had happened to me before. It started to put everything together. And then really the sort of doctrines of emptiness of a separate permanent self suddenly started to make tremendous sense and resonance. And the fact that I could experience that in my own body, mind, which I had already previously before, but didn't have the frames for it, that was super helpful. And then that really started to convince me that I was on something of a track that would work out well for me.
Right. Yeah, I like what you said about the differential equations being kind of pointing towards the most kind of fundamental layer, I guess, of reality, because the mainstream approach that's very kind of fixed in a kind of conceptual reductionist mindset, where we look at individual particles and we say that's the most fundamental thing, these kinds of solid material things. I think that leads to a lot of confusion, whereas actually if you zoom out to the kind of systems, holistic, interdependent perspective, what you said, this fluxiness, this process, this kind of constant change, that seems to be, if we want to talk about the most fundamental way of analyzing the world, it's systems, complexity, ecology, structure, and differential equations, right? Basically modeling, capturing those processes of change as we kind of emerge moment to moment. I mean, a lot of your stuff is around this concept of emergence. And I was actually wondering where that came from, that use of the term for an emergent phenomena for these experiences.
Yeah. So emergent phenomena arose of a few-month conversation, and we were like, what do we call our group? So we began to form around this idea of trying to upgrade the relationship between the clinical and scientific mainstream and what most people would call mystical, magical, energetic, psychedelic, psi, et cetera, phenomenon. And as we looked at ways we could possibly approach that, we thought about, what to call it. And then we wanted the name to do a number of things. We wanted it to not fall into the standard ontological problems that most experiments had done. We wanted to keep a certain ontological agnosticism or neutrality or openness about our work that would hopefully scale in a way that all the previous projects going back 140 years to the cosmic consciousness kids in the 1880s and 90s, like all of them basically bought some ontological frame, attempt to force that ontological frame on the world. It's going to be cosmic consciousness. It's going to be divine, whatever. It's going to be something, right? And that didn't work. It didn't work for the Abrahamic religions. It didn't work for the Muggles or materialists. It didn't work for, it didn't work for the majority of people that hadn't already drunk something of a perennial cosmic consciousness Kool-Aid. And and then they all failed. They all fell totally flat. And we thought we need to do something that somehow acknowledges and ties to previous attempts, like the important work of the transpersonal psychology people that have done numerous attempts to figure out how to relate to these phenomena, often based on the work of came out of Esalen and then the Groffs and a lot of other people, Emma Bragdon, and Jack Kornfield, et cetera. And they would talk about concepts like spiritual emergence or spiritual emergency. Whereas the vast majority of my clinical friends wouldn't understand why your arms flapping or seeing a bright white light or the feeling of your body dissolving would necessarily be spiritual, just from a sort of symptomatology or phenomenology point of view. That's kind of confusing. Like if you saw, like a spirit, okay, they could sort of see why you might call it spiritual, or the sense of you saw a god or a goddess or something. Okay, they can understand that, why you might use the word, but otherwise, I don't know. And so then figuring out how to simultaneously connect with the past and the previous literatures and honor the attempts, and yet drop some of the things that were clearly sort of confusing and or that might just get you into a whole lot of orthodox or ontological contests that are unlikely to be resolved anytime in the next few millennia, because we've had at least a few millennia of them and they haven't been resolved by some very smart people. They just lead to endless chaos. And so we thought, well, we can use the word emergence, which already sort of acknowledges not only this process of emergence, but from physics and biology and chaos math, we have this sense of properties that we don't really understand that seem to emerge out of complex systems in a way we don't get. So that seemed to have simultaneously the right level of historical reference and appropriate ontological agnosticism kind of already built into the term. That's kind of what emergence means. So
Right.
yeah, so that's why we ended up going with that, and nobody's been able to come up with anything better since. Not that it's a perfect term, and it's sort of alienating and confusing to some people, but it's what we have at the moment. That's what we're working with. What would you call it? I'm just curious. What would you do?
No, I definitely don't have a better suggestion. It was just a unique description of it. So that's an interesting answer. And another term, not to just linger on terms, but you've mentioned energetic phenomena a few times, and I think when people have a reductionist mindset where they reify kind of particles as thinking they are truly real in a way that other things aren't. To
Particles
talk of energy,
are real, huh?
I'm not saying that. I'm saying when you have that worldview, then you think, well, okay, like if someone experiences energy, that's not as real. Whereas, I'm coming from the perspective where everything is empty of essence, and so in the same way that, I feel like people have this with money, right? Where they realize that the banknote itself isn't of inherent value, but it's the structure, the relationships that gives it this something is there, something's happening, but it has no essence. And what people don't often realize is that that's true of literally everything, that everything exists through the interrelated structure, down to particles, but also down to what you might call energy. So if you pick up on someone having an aggressive vibe, say, like that's a real phenomenon in your interrelationship, that you're perceiving something, or you feel something in your body that feels like anxiety, right? This, to me, I guess, when you say energy, I feel like it is very metaphysically real, because what is real is a process, a dynamical changing, and it's the kind of just the feeling of that, the intuitive grasping of structure at a kind of an emergent, a higher level than at a level of particles. Does that resonate with your approach, or do you have? I'm assuming you don't reify energy in the sense of thinking it's real in the way that I was pointing to with particles earlier.
So I am something of a strict ontological agnostic, empirical pragmatist, as I've explained if you've seen previous podcasts. And breaking that down, what that means is relationships to the notion of ontology, what truly is. I hold all those very loosely, because what we actually do all the time is shift subtly or very strongly between various ontological frames as we do practical things in the world. Like you might be looking through the world through a very mathematical frame, like, for one bit of work, or a very statistical frame for another bit of work. But you would be unlikely to then step into a dinner party and relate to the world through that kind of a frame. Right. And so we shift pretty strongly our ontological views on things all the time. And our functional way we're relating to this, and we do it very sort of subconsciously or without really being understanding of what we're doing when we shift these frames. But if you start to notice that one does this all the time anyway, that you might, like trust in Allah, but tie your camel, that kind of thing, right? So that's like sort of where you go, okay, there's really two ontological frames that you're using to do that kind of work, and we shift between them, even though we may have a meta perspective that allows us to do that in some sort of functional way. And so I hold that same kind of view. I just hold it for basically everything. So I actually don't need to say this is real or this is not real, but I could if it was helpful for some situation. Like I could say, this is really a cup of water. Okay, that's pretty good. Fine. Sure. And that might be helpful for someone here. Here's the real cup of water I'm really handing you. Like that might seem reasonable enough. And yet I can also say this is all constructed, this is all experience, this is all just, an emergent property of insensate particles and forces. This is all the mind of God. And interesting to have adopted each or any of those frames, or this is all emptiness, or this is all a simulation, right? But the Bayesian in me, it's interesting, the Bayesian brain, you were talking about Shamil, has no, if I put a prior on any of those ontologies I just threw out for what this is or what the underlying structure of reality is, I have no way to do an experiment that moves the needle on that. And so whatever my priors are as a scientist, and a Bayesian, which I really am very kind of Bayesian. I think Brother Bayes was right and got a lot of things really right. And so I don't have an experiment that moves the deeper ontological needle on that. And so I hold all my ontological frames very lightly. But I want to get back to the question of the word real. So real is very interesting. I actually like things like occur, like sensations or experiences occur, or things occur, which allows that kind of sense of temporal ephemerality or moving or shifting or changing nature, right? Occur is a little bit different from real, and occur in experience is like even a little bit more precise, right? And then, but most people's definitions of real actually exclude things that might be causal, like, oh, I had a dream and the dream wasn't real, but I'm still feeling this way this morning from it. They'll say things like that. And so we have to be very careful with our definitions of real and consider the degree to which they overlap with our conception of causal, because most people's definitions of real are smaller than their definition of what's causal, which is pretty weird to me, right? And if you've got a definition of real that is not fully overlapping with your, in a Venn diagram sense with your definition of causal, I often go, okay, what you mean by real then is something that is functional and operational, of like, maybe if you had a dream that, your business partner had just stolen all your money, but you woke up and find they actually haven't. It's not that that dream wasn't a real experience, it's that it functionally may not actually apply to your waking reality in some kind of way, other than acknowledging the mood or residual strange feelings that might be resulted from it, that might need some exploration of why you had the dream or something. I don't know. But do you see what I mean? So I'm very careful with the definition of real and using that word, unless we're willing to be pretty loose about it. But in a formal context like this, I'm like, sorry, that was a long diatribe, but you get my sense.
I definitely agree. And that's why I was emphasizing that I use when someone says particles are real, they're reifying. They are kind of they're saying my perception of this thing as a solid, unchanging thing with essence. I think often that's what people are reaching for when they say something's real. So I agree with you that the closest you could get, more accurate to say something is real would be to say, for me, maybe that it occurs in relationship, like an event. There's some structure here. Things are relating in a certain way, and from that non-reductionist perspective. It's interesting because then we can say money is very much real. Money, it simultaneously is empty of inherent, what would you say, any essence of any value in itself as a separate thing, but in its relationship, in its structure, that the way that it causes things to happen, there is reality. Well, okay, I'm going to stop using the word reality because
it's functionally useful to assume
right.
that money is real in that kind of a way sometimes. They're provisionally
right.
or situationally, psychologically, there are times to assume that money is real, and there are times to also sort of look at it like it's just a bunch of ones and zeros existing in a computer somewhere, right? Okay.
Right.
And then the ability to flex back and forth between those might be psychologically or functionally useful, depending on what is happening in your life and that moment.
Right. Yeah, I think I have some dwelling to do on to whether or not I'm a kind of structural realist, because I think that if you take someone and put them by themselves on a desert island, in that situation, the cash they have in their wallet is no longer has the value. It no longer is money, really. It's now just bits of metal and piece of paper, because it can't be exchanged. and they are right to perceive it in a certain way in one situation, but they would be wrong to perceive it. The structures just aren't there. If they thought if they did everything they could to protect their money from being eaten by a turtle, then there may be some level of delusion about what the true structure is there.
But that might have been based on the functional nature that at some point they might be rescued, and then their cash would be
Right.
of some
Yeah.
use,
That was
perhaps,
the back
again,
of my
right?
mind. Yeah.
So like, right.
Right.
So like it's again contextual how one might
Right.
relate to that in a skillful way. But if they had absolutely no idea that they might be rescued, it might be more useful to use that as tinder for fires, for example.
Right.
But
Right.
that's a utilitarian functional causal decision rather than a question of reality, right? It's really a use case.
So I was
But
worried we may be
psychologically,
getting.
as they shift, that might help them adjust to various circumstances or decisions, right? Of like, oh, I'm burning my $100 bill, but it's useful because I can start a fire with it and I need to eat
Right. So
or
I
stay
was, yeah,
warm.
I was worried that we may be getting in the weeds too much, but actually this is great. I think this has come full circle to this being a really useful analogy because of what you were saying about shifting frames of what you think is, yeah, shifting your ontological frame. So this person, if they're in a pessimistic mood for based on what's gone on for them that day, they may think I'm not going to get rescued. And in this case, I'm seeing this money as fire kind of tinder. And if they're optimistic, they see a boat on the horizon. Now their frame has shifted. It's wise and useful for them to shift and say, no, this, once I get on the boat, I can give them this money as a thank you. Like maybe they're more likely to help me. So I think, yeah, all right. I think we've come full circle to a really excellent illustration of what you were saying. So in that case, you should be very careful to say the money really has value or it doesn't really have value. It's all a matter of what's a useful shift perspective, which you can shift between.
Yeah. Or they could use it as toilet paper, for example.
Right. Yeah. And you can keep going, right? And that's part of the fun of the experiential practices, I guess, of ultimately being able to play with these different frames. And so if we get back onto the more kind of conventional path of the interview of going through your experience. So we spoke about your kind of initial exploring this stuff, but then how did you begin practicing? Like what kind of meditation techniques did you start with?
Well, actually, to say when I really started, when I was about 3.5 or 4, and I know that by the house we lived in at the time, I could get into these blissful, peaceful states just by lying down on my parents' down comforter and breathing. And that was something I did a number of times. And then I stopped doing that. I have no idea why. And I started having lucid flying dreams at about age 5. And those were really cool and compelling and interesting. Have you had flying dreams or lucid dreams?
I haven't. But were they really cool?
Oh,
Were they real?
they were certainly really cool, regardless of real. Regardless of those kinds of questions. And then actually I took a weird hippie meditation course in 4th grade called Close Encounters, which was this guy teaching us basic like progressive relaxation techniques where you squeeze your toes and relax them, feel the warm energy coming in, squeeze your legs and, and those kinds of things and some visualization stuff. And we meditated for 10 minutes every morning in the Quaker school as well. It's just a Quaker hippie school thing in Durham, North Carolina, Carolina Friends School. And that was 10 minutes. So I did a little meditation. I actually didn't like it. I just found it irritating and sitting there bored as a restless kid mostly. But the visualization stuff I did like. And then around 14 or 15, I started visualizing to have better flying dreams. And before I knew it, my consciousness exploded and I traveled out of my body for the first time. The standard lift out, see yourself there, float through the wall, freak out, snap back, paralysis and buzz, and then what the heck? And then I started having strange energetic phenomena for about the next 10 years until I started going on meditation retreats. And I did my first 9-day at the Insight Meditation Society. And I had all kinds of wild experiences and powerful things and body dissolving into sort of wave particle vibration-y spark things and dissolving through the floor and all kinds of stuff. And I was like, okay, wait a second. This is powerful stuff and also seems to fit with my actual worldview, as I couldn't find anybody that was controlling thoughts and I couldn't find anything that was a stable thing anywhere. And yet there was this sense of something constantly recreating itself as a vantage point in what was clearly an impermanent and causal universe. So it seemed to me at the time. And still does really. And so I started exploring that further because it finally seemed to be a way to align my theoretical, scientific, quantum differential equations. Part of, I had taken modern physics with calculus in high school, and all of that seemed to be converging on the same thing that now I can do experientially. And yeah, it was off and running.
Right. And so then after a lot of practice, you know, my understanding is you kind of burst onto the Buddhist space after you claimed arhatship, right? This kind of reaching basically the end of the Buddha's teachings and having mastered them. Can you describe what that experience was like? Because you describe it right as a kind of before and after, right?
Bursting onto the scene, or the shift to what I call arhatship?
Let's start with your subjective experience of the shift and then talk about what it was like socially.
Sure. So the social stuff actually started happening before that, about 6 or 7 years before, online and online forums and in retreats where I was, getting various experiences and figuring out, usually through trial and error, mostly error, how to skillfully talk about these things with other people, and then finding a bunch of maps and frameworks like the Abhidhamma and Visuddhimagga and Vimudhimagga and other things in the old Pali Canon texts, and things like Mahasi Sayadaw's works and various countless other descriptions of interesting meditative territory, and then attempting to post about that online with forums and all of that. But so it was a long process, actually, of like me, coming out as some sort of public figure or whatever. And my journey as I learned more and practiced more. But the final sort of shift that I think of as the most important shift of them all was I had gotten to a place in April of 2003, so almost 20 years ago, a month away from being 20 years ago. And had gotten to this place where the vast majority of experience seemed to know itself where it was, to be fluxy, immediate thoughts of past and future were largely noticed as things that occur now, as wispy little things. But yet somewhere in the back of my something's like this teeny little annoying gnat that would not stop figuring out how to create a sense that it was a stable, continuous thing in a constantly changing, fluxing experience field. And so finally, I was hanging out on retreat with a guy named Sayadaw U Pandita Jr. at Malaysian Buddhist Meditation Center, and just doing what ended up being, in the second week of it, just relentless insight practice. And for those not familiar with what that would be, my goal was to see every single sensation, thought, intention, mental impression, sound, physical sensation arise and vanish utterly, all of them totally. So it was really going for 100%. Capture is the wrong word, but appreciation of these things all totally dissolving and there being no place to stand. And after about 2 weeks of that, suddenly the thing flipped over, and both the experience and the sort of in real time, immediate, built-in interpretation of all experience, suddenly that everything was just where it was, happening on its own, happening now, totally transient, totally natural. And that annoying sense of something that had to create some center point, watcher, doer, knower, controller, beer, anywhere in any of that, was just seen as more teeny little sensations that were no more than that. And so the whole of the fluxing, shifting, three-dimensional sense of reality, which you could call representational, or if you're an empiricist, you would call it the basis of reality, or whatever, put your favorite labels on it, it doesn't matter. But the experience of it since then, for almost 20 years now, has been the same, in that nothing does that anymore. Nothing is trying to figure out where it's, are these sensations of the back of the skin the real Daniel, or the eyes, or the sinuses, or this little flickering mental thing, image of a Daniel, are they the real Daniel? No, it's just unfolding immediate experience. And so this is something you can do for yourself by just noticing this quality of all of your six sense doors. If someone watching this podcast, these are learnable techniques and perceptual shifts that are available and that have been pointed to in a whole lot of different ways in a whole lot of different traditions. And it's actually weirdly straightforward. It was the biggest duh moment of my life, and finally seems to have resolved, for me at least, the sense of the problems that were created between my experience of my reality and my theoretical models of reality. And so that was super cool, and I'm extremely grateful for everybody who helped in that kind of a process.
Right. And the flipping over you described, so I had an experience of that when I was about 13, stress-induced, ruminating about Catholic theology, and I just reached a dead end of, there were no more thoughts to think. It was a kind of, almost like a Zen koan of like, worrying about going to hell because I didn't have blind faith, but this creator had made me without blind faith, and I couldn't just will myself to have it. And I reached a crescendo where I couldn't go anymore. And then I stopped thinking. And then, as you say, everything was just given in the present moment, perfectly blissful and peaceful and so obvious. Just like, oh, why was I doing this like contraction thing in my head when I could just be here? And so then my path has been I've not put in the hours that you put in terms of sit on the cushion. So I'm interested in, I would say my experience is relatively normal, probably as I'm going about. And normal, I just mean like the average, everyday person's experience who hasn't explored this stuff. Until I look. Whenever I look, there's no confusion. There's the kind of everything, as you say, is where it is. There's no doer, no perceiver. But generally, as I'm going about my day, I would say there's a bit of kind of contraction. I'm up here somewhere in my head, and that seems to work. It seems kind of useful. But I would say as I've, there's this Korean Zen book called Tracing Back the Radiance, which that phrase I like.
It's a good one.
That's kind of been my path of having this awakening, and then
have it up there somewhere. Yeah.
Right. Trying to kind of integrate the relative level of living normal life with this absolute perspective. And as I've done that, for me, it's been one of less and less contraction when I'm in the kind of relative egoic perspective, and a kind of being able to swim between the two more easily. And so kind of like you were saying, adopting different frames. And so the egoic feeling like a self frame, I kind of, maybe I still use it most of the time because it's habitual, and it feels kind of, it's still, there's part of me, I guess, it still feels a bit safer to be analyzing, to be kind of slightly stepped back from the world and like slightly separate. So it probably is associated with some unnecessary suffering. And as I progress, I would say that it softens. And so you, I suspect, have sculpted your brain through just relentless habitual practice in a way that I haven't, unless just through naturally practicing this way I have. But so is that anything like your experience, or is your experience really that there just is never any contraction around feeling like a separate self?
So this gets into really subtle thing, and thank you for sharing that experience, by the way. It's interesting. I think you had described that in another podcast of yours I saw, and it's cool to hear again. So yeah, really neat. So this is a complicated question, and it kind of depends on what you mean by contraction. And there's I actually think there's different flavors of contraction, and there's different flavors and varieties of what I'll loosely call identification. And so to actually tease this out without being confusing or saying something that either over or undersells the thing, we kind of have to take a look at what might be mean by contraction and identification, and think about the default mode network as well. So if you're up for it, I can take a little time to unpack a few of those, and to say, so the first thing is I literally I'm pretty sure that I've flipped my default mode network, so the default is now actually the space rather than the default mode network in the mode that it typically is. That doesn't mean I can't have default mode network activated when I'm doing problem solving or whatever, and I might kind of tune out, or like might be like, working in a coffee house and I'm on my laptop and I kind of tune out the chatter and noise of the room, which obviously is a default mode network kind of a thing, right? So the optionality for the default mode network to do the cool things that it can do rather than the problematic things it can do is still there. And like, I go, what am I going to say next and how am I going to organize my thoughts? That I going up is clearly a moment of default mode network activation. But the dominant experience is now actually the room, the colors, the monitor, the textures, the hand moving around the body, the space, the windows and the lights and microphone, and all of that is kind of where the attention now generally likes to be and is. So that was a first kind of a shift of, and I think that came about through a lot of training and practice and years and years and years of peeling away layers of this thing and then adapting to that and seeing another layer and peeling it away and adapting to that. So this is a very long, somewhat complicated process for me. And I know people for whom it's been a much faster process. So it doesn't mean it has to be an elaborate process. There's some people who seemed like I seem to be a hard nut to crack, but I also had a pretty tough nut cracker, if that makes sense. So like, I had the capacity to do powerful techniques and, have these powerful experiences, but it also seemed to take that for me to kind of like to do the thing, where I know people on way, they didn't have as powerful a nutcracker and techniques and experiences, but they also didn't seem to have as hard a nut to crack, if that makes sense. So they were able to more easily just go, oh yeah, this, and then be more comfortable in that more straightforwardly, that was not me. So that was the second thing I just wanted to say by way of normalizing these different processes. They proceed for people at totally different time scales and with different levels of drama and different levels of technique. So that's another thing. And a different way, radically different age ranges as well. So, and so then the next thing is related to stuff about identification. So, for example, like there are still definitely times where from a psychological point of view, the thing goes, ooh, ow, actually, like that hurt. That was, and then there's this sense of like, that interaction was painful, or my intuition is telling me something feels off or something. And there can be this sort of introspective, what is that? What is going on? How does that relate to the Daniel in the ordinary sense that is just some dude in the world? Right. And so a lot of that processing is still there in a very, very ordinary, down to earth, very real human kind of way. So that's the first important thing to say. And yet all of that, even the sense of contraction or expansion, take place in an experience mode that now does not do that separate split off thing. So there are modes of contraction and tuning out and introspection and psychological processing that still happen. So I don't mean to say those things don't happen, because they do. And they're an important part of seemingly the way the system functions. And yet, even in the midst of contraction, there's this sort of evenness or non-locality or something, even when the space gets small or the attention turns in, or there's a sense of psychological conflict or something, right, or challenge. And so both are kind of true, and you just need to be careful about which one you're talking about, and I kind of have more terms for each of them to really parse that out in a human living, actually the way it seems to manifest kind of way.
Right. I mean, so that contraction you're describing, for me, say if I stub my toe, there's definitely still an initial, I may even say ow out loud. And there's the extra kind of a bit of suffering. It's almost like a woe is me attitude of like, oh no, I've hit my toe. But then there's an automatic remembering to just literally come back to your senses and just be in the sensations. And then, oh, now all the tension's gone. It's just bright. There's no longer extra suffering, but there's still, as you say, a very human kind of, the option's still there. And I don't know if the option is still there, because it happens, but then it naturally releases. That I don't know if I could really choose to still be in the unnecessary suffering. And similarly, since all of our behavior is really scaffolded on the same survival instincts, this could happen interpersonally. If someone were to say something that made me feel anxiety or shame or something, I can imagine that might make me contract into a sense of assessing the situation and into kind of feeling separate. Or say if I'm driving and a car was swerving towards me, in that moment, I wouldn't be trusting enough of my intuition to be in a kind of flow state of just kind of reacting. I would probably try and contract into my head into a more analytical mode. Although as I say that, actually, that's probably not true. It probably happened fast enough that I wouldn't have the option not to trust the instinctive wide view process. So yeah, you're right. This gets quite subtle, and it's quite hard because there is no extra self that is really analyzing what's going on in these moments. It's quite, it gets quite subtle.
But the mammal, with all of its capacities, is still part of the system. And so that the mammalian system components and the way it reacts and the different layers and levels, you were talking about like instinct, and like suddenly that's a very limbic system, right. Lizard brain, fast reaction kind of thing that suddenly, our hands are moving to avoid the thing even before we really could process it. Most explanations are going to be retrofits on a very rapid habitual process. Same with if you stub your toe and you pull it back and you go, ow, and your whole body, that's some of those deeper structures just occur because that's the nature of the system and the conditioning. And some of that doesn't seem to be particularly negotiable. Right.
Yeah. I mean, so for me, the way that I map this onto what we know kind of scientifically about the structure of ourselves as organisms, but also make sense of my own experience is very much down to do with kind of safety like feeling safe to surrender, feeling safe to be in the flow of existence. And the reason, the reason we have a nervous system, the reason we do anything is because we're structurally trying to keep ourselves going and survive as living systems. So we have all these ways to to keep ourselves going. And then I think what often happens is these different aspects of ourselves, as you say, the kind of limbic, ancient, react parts that are quite good at getting us to navigate through different situations, versus the kind of rational cortex parts, they can become kind of not particularly integrated. And to me, the process has been one of becoming more and more integrated, having all these different parts of myself know each other, trust each other, through getting to know each other, and then also coming into more and more safe connection with. So I think of that as coming to safe connection with different parts of myself, but then safe connection with the world, making sure I'm my material needs are met, I'm in a genuinely safe place, and then connecting more to the present moment and to other people. And so it is this process of safe connection that has allowed me to trace back the radiance, to kind of bring my relative level of existence more and more into this space where it's very easy just to kind of to swim out into the context and just let the self drop and just be like, okay, here we are. I know I can walk over here and I don't have to. We all know what it's like to walk down the stairs without overly fixating, going, okay, now take that step. Now you move your right foot on that step. We trust it's safe, But if suddenly someone screamed at you, like, there's a step missing, you would probably collapse. It would make sense to collapse into a very kind of like, okay, I'm going to shift my attention because my survival relates on this. Or if suddenly someone tries to, points a gun at your head, it makes sense to focus your attention and feel like you are located in this organism. I don't have a question at this point. I'm just enjoying kind of swimming back and forth between this with you.
Nice. And, I talk with a lot of people who very understandably sort of fetishize expansive, very wide open, inclusive, flowy points of view, because those are obviously really nice. But there are definitely moments when not being in that mode and being in a more focused, contracted, filtered, targeted something mode is clearly super useful. So,
right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so I would say when people talk about this terrain, it's often done in language that is very exalted, because these experiences are kind of exalted. They are the kind of the far end of what is possible experientially. And when we're talking about release from suffering and bliss and stuff, like, sure, it makes sense. But I would say where my attention is this path from how do we get there from where we're at now, as how does a normal person start moving in that direction? So for me, it's I guess I'm more and more interested in using very simple. This is why I mentioned safe connection to me, because that's the kind of, if you can move towards safe connection, you're moving in the right direction. And it could go all the way to unitive states of where there is only connection, there is only interdependence. So, I'm interested to get into the kind of the sociology of this, because if we want more and more people to kind of wake up to this perspective, because the world isn't safe for many people, I think it's really, this is why I'm a huge fan of science, is it signals safety in the sense that we're showing our working out in public, we're testing, we're not just saying, trust me, we're not using dogma. So it's helping people come into that safe connection.
Well, actually, plenty of scientists are still hiding things and using dogma, but yes,
right.
the ideal aesthetic, regardless of the actual practice. But yes,
right. I mean that, and not to get sidetracked by another fascinating topic, but I mean the amazing thing about science, it's definitely, as a culture, doesn't live up to. I don't think it actually could ever live up to its ideal. But the ideal is self-transcending, where the kind of it transcends the practice of science and modifies it. So in science, there's a lot of reductionist thinking and people being very stuck in their worldviews because of their own personal success is tied to certain ideas. All that stuff goes on, but because of this commitment to evidence, because we all know that dogma is not okay, when it's pointed out, there is this, it keeps it modifying itself, and so you can't get stuck in the way that kind of religions can get stuck in dogma. But
you get these sort of generation level oscillations, right? So
right.
Science proceeds one death at a time. To be a little bit cynical, there isn't a resonant frequency of about 30 or 40 years that is people's careers of big structural change in scientific paradigms. So
right.
Okay.
So But so generally, with this attitude of like, how do we help people move along this path while simultaneously signaling that the stuff we're talking about is the good stuff. It's like, it's the real, it makes sense to use exalted terms, but they can alienate people. What I'm circling around here is what your take is on this, because you, by being very honest about your experience, and I don't doubt your experience, you seem to talk very kind of lucidly about it. But I think that honesty activates certain anxieties in people, maybe about like, can I trust this person? All that sociological stuff. So I'm very interested in what your experience was like after kind of opening up about this publicly.
Well, there's so many things actually to talk about in terms of the stuff you said. Like, is this all the good stuff? Like, it can also be the very challenging stuff, is the one thing I wanted to say. Like, I have friends who have found these experiences extraordinarily challenging to the point of life threatening and or life ending, right? And it's also the most valuable things I've ever come across in my entire life. So just acknowledging the spectrum of how this can be. And for some people, it's just super weird or confusing or destabilizing, right, as they go through these shifts, right? So just say, yes, there's a good component to it, but to be more balanced and broad, there's some other sort of weird and complex components to it that may require a lot of support and help sometimes, just to acknowledge that. But to back up, and the social, what you mentioned then is the social aspect, which is what it's like when you come out about this stuff. So I started being out about this stuff in the mid-late 90s online. And because there was a first edition of my book that was available a number of years before the thing finally flipped over, but a whole bunch of layers of the thing had sort of started to unravel. And so I started writing the book and put a version of it out there online before the final pieces seemed to flip over. And even doing that, like, there was an extremely wide range of reactions, most bad. Right. This freaks people out. They get angry. They get very defensive. They project a lot. They accuse you of being all kinds of terrible things, psychotic or a narcissist or whatever. Like, you can get a lot of stuff thrown at you. So if you're interested in doing the experiment, it's not quite as bad today because there's more people who are out about this kind of stuff. Whereas back then it was not a lot of us. And but the same reactions occur. And to be perfectly fair, these are reactions like my younger self would have had the same reactions to my older self, right? So I would have thrown the same reactions when I had a more muggly frame of mind, or materialist, or like, oh, really, or cynical, or whatever it was, way of looking at these things. My younger self would have said the same things to me today. So, okay. So, I don't think I'm beyond this and like, oh, I'm this way and won't react to people's claims. Well, younger versions of myself would have. Right. So, okay. Just to kind of normalize that and to say that we're each going through our process and related to reality through frames that we think are skillful for us. And a lot of people, maybe it's really important for them to cling to a non-threatened frame where reality is the way they think it is and experience is the way they think it is. And it's important for them to have some social interaction around that. So that's the nice way of sort of talking about the 8 worldly winds, of praise and blame and fame and ill repute and pain and pleasure and gain and loss that blow him personally as always. And even in their dialogue, perhaps those dialogues help sow some seeds of doubt or normalization or conversation. Like, it's some people's learning style is just to bang up against things and seeing how the thing bangs back against them or doesn't, or, what that resonance is, like sounding it out. And so that is some people's learning styles, is just to kind of crash into things or attack things and then see what comes from it. And there are things that I've learned from that way where I attacked something and actually they had really good arguments and I eventually learned something from that. Okay, cool. So I don't mean to needlessly pathologize some of these very challenging conversations or online forums, not to say that there can't be some really aggressive trolls and dedicated adversaries that can arise, right? So I have people, will find every single YouTube video I that posted about me and they'll make some negative comment about me. And so that's likely guaranteed, to occur on this comment thread. And they're seem to be really into that. And that's part of their shtick and thing. Okay. And that's still ongoing, 20 something years later. And that's how they, find it a useful use of their time. All right. I don't presume to understand all of their motivations for that, but perhaps they're making rational decisions. I don't know.
Right.
And
sorry, continue.
Yeah, no, go ahead. I'll stop there. Yeah.
The I mean, just what you were saying about people's learning style being to kind of to test and you know put pressure on it. I mean, I think you're right to normalize it, because in some cases, if someone stands up and says something unique has happened or special has happened, or and say they are a narcissist and they do want to exploit people, if you push back and then they show some cracks, well, then actually that was a good that was good to reveal that, and I guess. So it's wise. It's not that it's coming from a place that's unnecessarily negative or destructive. This is why I mentioned kind of safe connection earlier, because whilst surrendering into reality, whilst coming into alignment with reality, we do need to make sure we're doing it wisely. It's just in our structure to want to keep ourselves safe. So just trusting blindly is not, I mean, it comes back to my formative experience of not having blind faith. I still don't have blind faith. And I think it's wise to not have blind faith. But yeah, please continue.
Yeah, it's good. And then the other thing is like coming into a place of safe connection. It's interesting. My path was in some ways that, because I found teachers and I found communities and I found resonance and I found books and I found the sense of, others who had been on the journey. And I found that very normalizing and healing and helpful. But my meditative practice, while aspects of it were like safe connection, like getting into these, massively expansive, blissful, peaceful states, right? The sort of path of like jhanic states and formless realms and boundless consciousness and the fourth jhana and stuff like that, which very much writes those kinds of sense of openness, safety, and peace and connection and dissolving of boundaries on the brain. That's the one side. The other side was the insight side, where the way I was practicing insight practices was literally to tear the whole mound of suffering to shreds, right? Which is kind of the opposite of that sense of safety and connection. It was kind of the ultimate in dissolvey and just,
Right.
Deconstructive and shreddy. And that I actually am really happy I had kind of both sides of it, and that my path included both of those. And the sense of suffering and acknowledging challenging mind states, and the suffering of having been born, of life and, birth, old age, lamentation, pain, sickness, grief, and despair, and all of those things that the Buddha talked about. Like, okay, yeah. And so validating that side too. So there was this sense of like my path involved this wide range from very, very lovey, connected, divine, expansive, dissolvey, to shreddy, painful, challenging, blow the whole thing to shreds, tear it all down.
Right.
And yeah, just to sort of talk about both sides of the equation.
Yeah, I definitely want to get into what you mentioned earlier about people having challenging experiences
Yeah,
with this
that.
stuff, because, and this is very much what informs this. So I'm enjoying talking, that you're mirroring back my language around safe connection, because this is a recent thing I've been playing with that I found quite useful. So for me, I was in a place of real emotional distress when I was a teenager, and I had this experience. And the experience was, it was a true solution, but it was a bypassing solution, in that I could just be with whatever was in the present moment, and it really did get rid of the suffering for those moments. But then I would collapse back into my sense of self, and the suffering would still be there. And it was only through relative level practices, psychotherapeutic practices, embodied, somatic, stress release, all this kind of stuff, that I came into safe connection with myself and to the world. And to me, so on the whole path, when people would talk about having challenging awakening experiences, for a long time I was kind of confused as to what they could mean, because to me, awakening has always been synonymous with feeling deeply grounded, like deeply connected and peaceful with the world, if not with myself.
You're one of the
And
lucky ones.
yeah, but it's yeah. So then with the I mean, I'm no longer kind of confused, but I think after reflecting on it for a long time and hearing people's stories, but I suspect what it is that the in my conception, it really included everything. So any struggles I was going through was still part of this kind of this process that was not self, that was just, it was what it was, and in its own time it would find its right equilibrium. And so when it comes to how we teach this stuff and the path we lay out, this is why for me it feels necessary that we don't just tell people, okay, meditate, try and immediately connect with the present moment in an intense way. Because if you're not in a materially safe way, if your connection to the world isn't safe, And if psychologically you're carrying traumas, you're inviting all that stuff to get processed. And so I feel genuinely saddened by the lack of trauma-informed stuff in the kind of mindfulness space, because it feels like people are again and again promising this will help you with well-being, and it is, the evangelists are right that it is a master trait coming into awareness. That is the path, like that is the right direction. And then you've got the skeptics who see the people who are wounded and damaged by, re-traumatized with this stuff, and they're like, what are they talking about? Mindfulness is overblown, and there's wisdom in both, and we really need a synthesis of these two things. And so that's why, the safe connection thing for me feels like the way forward. And if you can take that gradual path where you're not jumping at the deep end, or you're not ignoring or trying to bypass the psychological stuff, to me that feels like the wise way for the average person to kind of move in this direction.
Assuming they have the choice. Like, I was just doing relatively light end practices and I found myself with deep end experiences. And so we don't always get to choose which of these paths we will be. We don't get to choose whether we'll be a fast practitioner or a slow practitioner, or a deep end practitioner or a shallow end practitioner, or it will be really painful and challenging, or it will be really blissful and peaceful, and how those each oscillate and change moment to moment, because these often are very dynamic things. And so, we don't always get to decide which of those we're going to be. We can try, so it appears, we can try to seemingly make those decisions from an ordinary, I have will and I have control and choice point of view. Right. But, that book right there, which is the second edition of my book, Mastering the Core Teachings of the Buddha, in the first section of the book is called The Foreword and Warning, because it's talking about the fact that stuff can be destabilizing, confusing, socially alienating, and we don't always, and traumatizing, and potentially life-threatening, right. And certainly potentially sanity-threatening. And so, and while some of us will get to say, okay, from a relative will point of view, I'm going to choose the safe path. I'm just going to do low dose meditation. I'm not going to plunge in the deep end, do intensive retreats or psychedelics or, vision quests or whatever. But some of us find ourselves on that path anyway. And then how do you deal with that? And so, and I wouldn't really, looking back, have traded that for anything. I think it was kind of amazing, but it also had its problems, right? It wasn't free. And so thinking that's the wise path, well, okay, cool. And maybe for you, and certainly for a reasonable number of people, assuming you can choose.
Right. Yeah. So I guess what I'm advocating is more on the way it's taught side, so that, so take something like meditation apps, right, which is a very common way people come to meditation now. I would say I think what you referred to as shallow end practices, just basic mindfulness. At the moment, it's like people are being told to just jump in the pool, and maybe it's not that deep, but if they've not been taught to swim, people can have a really tough time. What I'm advocating is having people stand at the side of the pool, having a gradient so they can literally get their feet wet, slowly walk in, test what it's like to swim, and so I think there's this, that seems to be missing to me, is the neuroscientifically and psychology informed practices, that experiential practices that take you from a normal frame of reference, an everyday frame of reference, into this kind of connection with the present moment. And I think, I'm optimistic that will be the next generation of the way, because, these ancient techniques have been kind of just shoved into a Western secularized context with a lot of the old kind of framing
or
missing,
new age or something. Right. But yeah.
So we're trying to figure out how to integrate these, right? And I think there's still a ways to go. Is that your instinct that we're going to learn and modify how these things are taught in the West?
Well, that's actually what I spend like 50 hours per week of my time working on. So we haven't talked about the EPRC yet much, but the Emergent Phenomenology Research Consortium is the now over 200-person group that is dedicated to helping sort a lot of this out, to get us some evidence quality, so informed consumers, practitioners, patients, et cetera, can have, high quality data on the risks, benefits, and alternatives of various practices, approaches, ontological frames, doses, combinations, sense of predisposing factors for good or bad outcomes, a wider palette of how to relate to things of nosology, meaning diagnosis, of management for the challenging stuff, of cultivation for the positive stuff, and how those might meet with a person's individual risk tolerances, goals, logistical realities, psychological predispositions and challenges they're bringing into it. Maybe even genetics, I think, is where we're likely to be going at points. And to have high quality data on all of that so that informed consumers can really think carefully about doing good, avoiding harm, and then figuring out linguistically how that scales globally, how we avoid a lot of the linguistic challenges that came out of all the previous attempts to do this, which usually picked ontological and linguistic frames that were guaranteed dead on arrival and not going to scale globally. And so to do better, that's the goal of the Emergent Phenomenology Research Consortium, and what I now just pour my time, social, financial, et cetera, capital into, and to try to figure out how in the world we get a big enough team. We have a really super detailed plan. You can check out our white paper. We have some amazing researchers, and at the moment we're primarily funding constrained. So we've got a lot of talent, a lot of capability, really thoughtful plan that we've come up with over years of careful conversations with brilliant people at top universities and other smart people who are at other types of universities and professionals, et cetera. And now we just really need the money. So
Right.
If somebody out there watching is a philanthropist inclined to help with this project, please knock on our door. We'd be happy to have the conversation.
Right. And is that door
Sorry for the shameless
Emergent's
fundraising pitch
No,
for
no.
the charity.
I was going to ask you, is that Emergent's benefactors? Would that be the place to go for people to donate?
Yep, ebenefactors.org for the charity, or if you want to read our detailed white paper on the plan, you can find us at theeprc.org, the Emergent Phenomenology Research Consortium, basically, but abbreviated .org. Yep,
and
that's what I spend my time doing these days, because, I'm fine. A lot of my meditation practitioner friends are fine. We got tremendous benefit. That's awesome. But figuring out how the rest of the world can not only get a lot more support for this process, a lot more normalization, a lot better data quality, but also the way the clinical mainstream could not be an active barrier by saying this either doesn't exist or is all crazy and needs meds or whatever, which unfortunately is still pretty much the standards in the DSM and textbooks of emergency medicine, emergency psychiatry, neurology, general practice, mental health care, et cetera.
Actually, that's a good segue into something I wanted to talk to you about, which is the studies you've taken part in and having your brain scanned. And because I guess the role of science in validating people's subjective claims, right?
Yep.
For the audience, I mean, something that's just quite fun is if you could share what changes occurred in your brain, after this experience.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. So, changes occurring in my brain
as far as we can tell
measure
from the studies. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'll tell you a story, and this is thanks to Judd Brewer and Willie B. Britton. So this is I don't know, 8 years ago or something, or 9 years ago, I guess at this point, somewhere around there. I got to be part of some early studies of fMRI on the default mode network with that team then, and I got in the fMRI, and this is an fMRI where I'm like, got this thing strapped to my head and it's really super loud. And I'm like doing these experiments where I get about 8-second delayed feedback on whether or not my PCC was activated or deactivated. That's a part of the default mode network that, as far as I can tell, is like the degree to which you tune out sort of consensus space of see, hear, feel, and tune in inner reality. And so we were doing all these things to see what meditations and biofeedbacky kinds of things, allowed the PCC to be more or less active, active being default mode network activated, deactivated meaning less blood flow, blood flow as a proxy for activity in the fMRI, being less active, meaning default mode, that part of the default mode network, which is a complicated structure, actually. There's a bunch of compensatory other aspects to it. It's not just one thing. And they were doing these experiments of like, how can I get it really deactivated, meaning really be in the present moment? What sort of meditative techniques or states of mind or focuses really seemed to deactivate the PCC, and was that mirroring my own experience? And then we started doing some experiments of like, what would really activate the PCC and activate the default mode network? And they said, okay, we're gonna do this other thing. It's kind of off protocol, but this is going to be kind of fun. I was supposed to be in there for about an hour, and I stayed in for about 3.5 because we were having a lot of fun doing things. And so we started playing around with what'll make it activate. And they said, well, think a bunch of neurotic thoughts. So I'm like, okay. So I start thinking a bunch of neurotic thoughts. I'm like, oh, they've seen a glioblastoma multiforme on my fMRI, but they're not telling me because they want to get really good scans. But when I come out of the scanner, they're going to tell me I have a terminal brain tumor and they should seek ontological care and start writing my will or whatever. And I'm like thinking these thoughts. And the PCC is really deactivating. And they were like, Daniel, are you thinking neurotic thoughts? I'm like, yeah, thinking pretty neurotic, paranoid thoughts. And they're like, well, it's not deactivating. I'm sorry, it's not activating. It's staying inactive. What's wrong? And I was like, I don't know, maybe like and I was like, oh, I'll bet I need to know I need to think like I used to. And so because I think thoughts in the room, so I'm sitting here and there's this like sense of like colors of the monitor and the space and thoughts are arising of what I'm going to say, but I can see your eyes blinking and your smile, and like there's this sense of presence to consensus space even when thinking thoughts. And I said, oh, but I need to tune the room out. And so I started thinking the same neurotic thought pattern, but I just tuned the room out. And then the PCC really activated. And then it was like, okay, that's the thing. And so I recognize I don't think the way I used to, because now thoughts are this wispy little part of this, waking, mostly consensus-based integrated experience most of the time, unless I'm like really having to check what's on my calendar next week or something. There's some things that it seems to activate for a moment. But my default is to be here in the room with you, or, the monitor and the camera and the microphone or whatever, when I'm thinking. And so that seems to be a real change where my default mode network, as far as I can tell, is actively different, even when thinking what for many people might be really default mode network activating.
Right.
And so that was a thing that I was able to show. And that was really fun. And it's like, okay. And the other super exciting thing, thanks to Judd and Willoughby, is like, wow, you can kind of see this stuff. You can see different states. They can actually measure these things now. And so I've been since then a part of a number of studies. I went up with Judd to another study in the Yale EEG, trying to replicate the beamforming stuff for the PCC, and then came up to UMass twice when he was there at John Kabat-Zinn Center for Mindfulness. And then I've got to be a part of some studies of glymphatic flow, which is like brain fluid flow at Vanderbilt. And I'm going to be a part of another one of this with Dave Vago and his team. And then have been part of, I spent, basically like 8 hours a day for 5 days in a 7 Tesla fMRI at Martinos, which is associated with Harvard and McLean Hospital and MGH, Mass General, last August, as part of a bunch of studies related to meditative gymnastics. So states and stages, going through those and looking at them on fMRI and EEG. And you can see real shifts in states and stages, which is super cool. And so we're actually getting some ability to at least measure that when people report subjectively they are in particular states, those may correlate to certain brain regions being more or less active, or certain patterns of EEG activity changing. And that's something we can see now. And we have some submitted papers now that are coming out on some of that work. That's really exciting.
Yeah, I love the posterior singular cortex PCC story, because it really illustrates this. We often point to the default mode network in terms of its role in kind of mind wandering, mental time travel, being lost in thought, and is, parts of the network are these kind of high level cortical structures that are involved in this very abstract stuff. But the PCC in particular is very coupled with limbic, very emotional parts of the brain, and also has this role in attention. So what you described really maps onto our understanding of what this very crucial part of the brain's doing. And so it's a nice way of talking about your experience with another lens, coming back to this idea of lenses, of saying to someone, the way our brains evolved and the kind of standard mode you might be in is to be doing this thing where you're shifting your attention onto yourself and your emotions, and as you say, tuning out the room. But it's all kind of habitual, and you can't shift out of it. And it doesn't feel very good because it's anxious and you're kind of self-concerned. But there's this other way to be, which is just to be in the room, or say someone's looking at a nice sunset, but they can't help but ruminate about work or something. Being able to say, well, actually, if you could physiologically train your brain so that you have the option to quieten down that network and say, you don't have to be stuck in this pathway of obsessing about work. You could actually just tune your attention to this context and lose your sense of self and just be here. I think it's a very grounded way of talking about it. And I think that's part of the reason that science can kind of, if you made these claims and then they scanned your brain and it just didn't line up with anything neuroscience has shown, different parts of the brain, just has, say the PCC had nothing to do with attention, nothing to do with emotional thoughts, then it might be like, all right, maybe this is someone who's just making up stories. But it's nice that it really maps on well.
Yeah, and we've got the funds to scan a bunch of other meditators who are coming and have been coming, and so we're going to compare across a whole bunch of different people and see what are the similarities, what are the differences, right? So it's not just one dude in a scanner saying, oh, look at my blobology or whatever, these colored blobs on an fMRI printout, but trying to see how this correlates across different practitioners, different techniques coming from different traditions, sometimes reporting different or similar experiences, and really trying to sort that out at a high level using the best tools and tricks and analytical capabilities we have at this time. So that's what's also really fun, is to do this in community and participatory way, where we get to trade off and say, oh, look, someone can do this and that's cool. Oh, but this is different. And oh, what does that mean? And then we can explore this as a community, moving forward together, which is not often what happens in these worlds. Right, it can be kind of competitive or proprietary orthodoxy or secretive or whatever, but luckily there are people who are willing to do much more open, collaborative investigations of what's possible and what we can all learn from each other. So that's really fun.
Right. It'd be funny if it caught out a con artist. If there's someone out there who's just listened to lots of podcasts like this and has got really good at regurgitating certain phrases, you put them in the scanner and then they're telling, oh yeah, no, I'm in a completely awake, selfless state, and their brain tells the story of someone who's actually ruminating about the experimenters. But I think at this point we probably wouldn't be able to use the brain scans in a kind of diagnostic way like that. I don't think it's, in your case, it's very vivid. The story you told is a very vivid example, but usually you have to average over people, average over time. And when you see blobs on brains, it's not as simple as it lights up in real time and goes off, right?
And our brains are not all quite the same or all wired the same.
Right.
Some people have variants of structure and variants of how it's all put together, and sorting that out will take a lot of data, a lot of time. It's still very early days, but it is also definitely possible to envision a world where what you just said of like, okay, prove it, this is coming, I think. So, and that will be both disappointing to some and really heartening to others, and like all this technological innovation.
Right. And speaking of different studies, I think it's on the Emergent Benefactors website. You have a very detailed kind of breakdown of different studies that you'd like to do, which is really interesting to read. And some of them are on psychedelics as well, right?
Yeah. So we're broadly interested. So Emergent Benefactors and the EPRC are broadly interested in what we call emergent practices, or just things that lead to emergence, even spontaneous or whatever situations. However it happens. And by emergence, we mean spiritual, mystical, magical, psi, energetic, that kind of basket of stuff. And psychedelics are the way, most of the meditation teachers that taught me, they were hippies back in the day, and they did a bunch of acid or, purple microdot or orange sunshine or whatever they were doing back then. And they had these powerful, experiences. And then they, a lot of them was like, okay, but maybe we can do this through meditation. And so, but that was a lot of their first opening. And a lot of the people I talk with about meditative practices, their first big thing was like, oh, I did shrooms at 16 or whatever out in a cow pasture field with a bunch of my friends in the moonlight. And, I was never really the same, and they were off on the journey. And so given that not only is meditation scaling through the work that mindfulness does and all the apps and it being incorporated into healthcare systems and all that, but also psychedelics are scaling through the corporations and through the legalization or the decriminalization, and this becoming, being moved forward by organizations like MAPS. And that's an amazing thing in some ways, but we also know these can cause challenging experiences, confusing experiences, and it's not all just, unicorns and rainbows and paisley patterns. It can be also a mix. And so the EPRC is very much positioned as like, great, we just want high quality data on risk, benefits, and alternatives. What does this lead to? What's the phenomenology? What are the progressive elements of this? What are the predictive elements of this? And how do you help people have good outcomes and meet their own therapeutic and lifestyle goals? And if they find themselves in situations where suddenly those are shifting or changing, how do we support those shifting, changing processes in a skillful way and do that globally? and psychedelics are as much a part of the mix as anything. And so that's also part of what we're working on. Yep.
Right. Yeah, and I think there were some studies suggested on 5-MeO-DMT, which seems to its phenomenology seems to match up nicely with the kind of unitive no self experiences we've been talking about here. Is that something you're more focused on than, say, I don't know, other psychedelics, ayahuasca, for example?
So we, the EPRC is pretty broad. So, we have members at Imperial College and members who are doing research through other universities. And we have some social connections to David Yaden and Roland Griffith, sorry. And my brain and names are sometimes glitchy. And we have, it's a broad team. And so we don't necessarily have a particular focus or emphasis at the moment beyond what is organically emerging of the interest of various members of the group. And clearly 5-MeO seems to stand out as anybody who's done it or taken it says it is something special, something unusual, and they will use like void, ego dissolution, a total destruction of ordinary conceptual reality. It can, when for people who break through on this, you get these extremely dramatic reports of it being something far out beyond even ordinary DMT and its colors and lights and stuff, and into the realm of incomprehensibility and disappearance of reference points. And they just sort of like mind boggled with attempts to use words for this. But there's also plenty of reports, and I'm not saying any particular person should or shouldn't do this. You should do your own research and figure this out. But of people who say like, I was one way and then I did 5-MeO and I'm another way.
Right.
But also happens with LSD and psilocybin and mescaline and sometimes MDMA and other things, right? And so in ketamine, I know some people who they were one way and they did ketamine, it shifted something. So there are plenty of things that can activate this sort of shift or flip, as Jeffrey Kripal puts it in his book, where you get some kind of paradigm change, right? Where functionally, structurally, ontologically, experientially, you're something else. And so a lot of things can activate that process, but clearly 5-MeO is one of them.
Right. Yeah. And I've had experience with 5-MeO that I found very kind of therapeutic because it's very surrendery. There's a lot of kind of somatic tension release that can happen. And
if you can surrender, but people who cling and don't surrender, it can be nightmarish, right? As it feels like it's tearing through their defenses rather than opening them up to infinity or something.
Right. And so, I mean, there are some famous people who really illustrate these points. I think Mike Tyson's one person who had the before and after thing that's spoken about with 5-MeO. And Michael Pollan spoke about how he, in his book, in How to Change Your Mind, how basically it was the one substance he would never do again. He just hated it because it sounds like he didn't let go. He felt like he was being shot into space, but it was like he was holding on to the spaceship and the whole time, and it just wasn't good. But yeah, so
that
for me,
rocket come up, a lot of people find very, very challenging and disconcerting and a real turnoff.
Yeah, exactly. It is very rapid and it fits with what we were talking before about the kind of, instead of coming into safe connection with yourself, and it's just like rip everything apart, destroy it. And but if you're in the right place, I mean, for me, it's been wonderful. Nice. There's none of that negativity. It's just a powerful tool. But I bring it up, my own personal experience, because it's interesting, the phenomenology you were pointing to. And for me, it's always it feels like connecting with, it feels like an insight that what exists is an eternal interplay of form and formlessness, a void that's constantly birthing form. And I'm inclined to think that is kind of what's happening. And it's kind of, it forces you to, well, it carries this kind of ontological certainty of like that you're seeing what's really happening. And it has this funny character of where it's almost like the void, formlessness births form, because it's kind of in its nature that it can't exist as nothing forever. And so it kind of needs to come into form. And in doing so, it's like it's finding what it needs to do, but then from the form, it needs to return to formlessness. And so it's this like a shepherd tone, this ever increasing awakening to kind of it's almost like searching for release, searching for resolution and never finding it, and constantly constantly like going, oh wow, oh wow, oh wow, because it always thinks it's going to be oh wow, but then we'll find rest, but it doesn't. And so this, it's just this eternal groove between form and formlessness in my experience, which takes you back to a very, in my, you know, that initial, it's interesting to think what's happening in the brain in that case, because it could be the sense of what I'm describing as kind of an ever increasing oh wow, could just be the fact that our brains evolved to model and grasp onto the world, and when it can't do that, there's a kind of constant error signal, prediction error signal, that's just compounding. And so there's there's work to do to unpick what's really going on with these experiences. So I'm glad that you're
really going on
science. Right, I guess I should say, what's a more precise way to say that?
What we can measure using current things and our best attempts to interpret them.
I mean, when I say what's really going on, I guess I mean not taking your initial subjective instinct at face value. Like, see what can be said about what's occurring that holds up from multiple vantage points, as opposed to just reifying and saying, nope, like I had an insight, it's definitely that way. Kind of like we were saying with the brain scans, testing that against people's verbal reports. And I feel like we're going to keep circling back to the reality thing.
Yeah. And going back to the sense of like, that's the real thing, is the oscillation of manifestation potential or whatever, like, those kinds of, so I should also, this is going to be one of those claims that's going to annoy some people who don't like me making claims. So trigger warning, as we say these days. So trigger warning, I've had pretty much all of the ontological experiences as a result of having been somewhat prone to them and done tons of intensive, high dose practice and really going for those kinds of things. And so the sense of that noetic quality, experiences that have that deep sense of knowing, that deep sense of truth, that deep sense of, oh my God, this is how it really is. That is a quality that can arise, and we like it. Obviously, we like that deep sense of knowing, except when it arises with things we don't like. So that's the other thing. Sometimes you can have the deep sense of knowing that we are totally, screwed. You know what I mean? Like that deep sense of knowing, we don't like that one. But the rest, in general, we actually do like a sense of certainty, or compellingly like, wow, particularly with regard to profound experiences that are pleasant or neutral. And so having had kind of all of them, I'm in a funny position ontologically. And when I say all of them, like, also, I'll tell you what I mean by that. Like my ongoing immediate experience is that there's literally only this moment, that any thought of past or future only occurs now, and that everything knows itself where it is. And yet within that frame, I have had utterly as equally compelling senses of past lives arising, with the sense that truly I was a this or a that in the past, and they have that deep sense of psychological resonance and truth at a very psychological time-based frame. So from a time frame, that of course I was a this and a that in a previous life, and they have that same noetic quality of equally with my immediate experience. They have that same sense of incontrovertible, resonant, deeply felt true truth, simultaneously with the sense that all is truly just void, or all is just pure, dissolved, meaningless energy, or all is the luminous, stable dance of the divine, cosmic, utterly eternal consciousness, but have had that as a transient experience. Anyway, and so like, and I've had each of those a bunch of different times. And I only had one or two of them, particularly if they kind of aligned with each other, then it would be much easier to be ontologically on board with any of them. But since things cannot be, purely utter transience and yet eternal cosmic consciousness, and they cannot be, there is no moment but this moment, and simultaneously have the sense of utterly compelling past life experiences, right? When you've had enough of these, eventually you kind of get the joke that reality can create anything and give us a sense of hyper strong noetic quality along with it. Like, this guy is definitely a psychopath and he's just making up all this bullshit on a YouTube channel and I should definitely comment on it on YouTube. I'm totally compelled with that being my reality, right? Any of these things can arise as we get to know and see. And then people tend to fixate on, if they've just had a few, they tend to, particularly if they cluster and don't contradict, then they tend to fixate on those. And if they contradict, they often gravitate towards one. And then I, for whatever reason, have had so many of these things that I can't land anywhere and I'm weirdly comfortable with that. And yet I can appreciate what each of those noetic qualities has led to something healing or fascinating or interesting, or ability to connect with other people who have had that experience, or, put it into some mappy progressive context or whatever I can do with it. Right. So those are all useful, interesting things that can arise from that, but can also cause social conflict. But my truth is the true one. It is truly divine, luminous, eternal consciousness. It cannot be void and dissolving and, total immediate transience. It can't be that one. It can't be emptiness. It can't be, so anyway, and then they get annoyed when you don't converge to theirs, right? So there are pros and cons to all of these, but it puts me in a very funny ontological place. And I will just offer that out as there are people like me who have had that happen to them. And then how do you relate to that skillfully in a way that helps people do something useful with their lives is my eternal question.
Right. Yeah, I love where this is going. So, so my kind of perspective after my initial kind of awakening experience as a teenager was just, non-dual isness. Everything arises where it is, only this present moment, the thing you described, right? And it had that noetic quality of I've seen the truth. Mm-hmm. And I then spent a very long time just thinking, right, this is it. And then everything I learned in science matched with it. It seemed, and it still seems to me this day, that this is I guess this is still my fundamental picture of the world. And
I still have things that are deeply compelling for me as well. Like that sense of deep, that one.
But then for me, rather than going through concentration and practices and associated techniques, for me, it was always through psychedelic therapeutic work that I had the far out experiences, like DMT and also with LSD. And my first DMT experience really, it was the first time I'd had an experience with a noetic quality, equally profound, equally certain during the experience, but it was of being pulled out of the simulation by weird kind of animatronic clowns that were slapping me around and laughing in my face, and then being laid at the feet of some Hindu deity who kind of told me that the classic kind of Hindu kind of thing that I am it, but I was also relating to it, and it was utterly humbling, and it just felt utterly real. So then that shook me for a while, and I made me realize my metaphysical kind of attachments that I was concerned with. I wasn't just going to go, oh, okay, fine, now I'm a Hindu or whatever. That wasn't or I believe in the simulation. I really had to do some soul searching, and for me, in all of these practices, I was always moving towards non-attachment and surrender and openness and allowing and coming into a sense of being present. And what always happened in every single case was that there was always some emotional kind of charge underneath the reification of feeling like this is really it. So especially with kind of entity encounters, when I really dropped into a kind of non-dual, a kind of socially non-dual relationship with these experiences, where I was like, we're all equally arising. And so it's almost like my right, if I'm afraid of these entities or I'm concerned about their ontological status, it's like my left hand being afraid of my right hand, that they're going to start fighting with each other. And when I had that kind of release, and now there was just something was processed around social, the risk, I guess, that other social entities could pose towards me. And then one of the kind of, I had a really funny experience with high dose LSD experience where I, as a raised Catholic, had this real anxiety around the kind of Christian metaphysics. And I had this experience where I had done a lot of releasing of kind of embodied tension. And then I got very much kind of in my head. And then it was like a kind of biblical, the voice of God basically revealing that the Christian kind of theology is completely true. And then kind of each layer of the universe kind of imploding to reveal another layer of angels, and then that imploding and shooting, and just the most grandiose thing imaginable. And as it was happening, there was a sense of like, oh no, like I don't like this. I mean, on one hand it's humbling, but exactly like in the Old Testament, that it's like terrifying, but it's awe-inspiring, and but there was still that sense of James who really doesn't really want this to be the kind of ground truth of reality. But then I had enough presence of mind to not resist, to not take off my eye mask and get up and freak out. But I was just like, okay, I'm breathing. Okay, if this is true, that's true. I'm allowing, I'm accepting. And then I got to the ultimate layer and it collapsed. And it was basically like a 90s Spice Girls music video, like some cheesy like thing. And then and then that's what I did. I laughed, just this deep laugh of just like, oh, thank God. Like it isn't, it seemed like I was being given Ezekiel's revelation, and it could not have been more convincing. And then it was just like my mind was like, come on, now we're just going to play around with whatever. So for me, I do always circle back to a kind of scientific worldview combined with a kind of non-dual, I'm leaning towards calling this kind of non-dual naturalism at this point, where I do think these things are kind of psychological, archetypal experiences that are coming from within me, and that the ontological test for their reality is really, just science being able to show repeatedly that, there's something here. So I know we haven't got into this whole terrain of your experience, which I'd love to, and I'm jumping ahead slightly. So I'd like to maybe bring the audience up. I've listened to you speak about the Fire Kasina candle flame practice you did, and this kind of deity encountered. So I'll give you the floor to kind of to go wherever you want with this.
Yeah, sure. So Fire Kasina, for people who don't know what that means, and thank you for all those stories. That was really nice. I appreciate that.
You're welcome.
So and the laugh, that's always good. So Fire Kasina is this old technique that comes out of some of these books, and it's clearly pre-Buddhist. This is old elemental practices. And basically the way that we do it is you look at a candle flame or a LED light on your phone, or a overhead light in your room, or whatever it is, and just long enough so you get a good after image not to hurt your eyes, and then you close your eyes, and then you follow the colors, whatever they do, wherever they go on the inside of your eyelids or your inner space or whatever. And then once you're done, you open your eyes and you look again and you refresh, and you just do that again and again and again. And we have a whole website dedicated to talking about people's reports of what happens when they do this at Fire Kasina with a K, KASINA.org. So that's FIREKASINA.org. And at the Fire Kasina site, you can find endless reports of all the wild, wondrous, strange, transformative, challenging, and even quite concerning things that can happen. The first talk I ever give, when we do this in intensive settings, is this is not safe. So just so you're aware, like, you have been warned, and it's not safe in the same way psychedelics are not safe, but you're actually building these experiences on your own wiring. So you have even less chance that it will go away if something goes strange because it's not a substance wearing off. It's like you built this into yourself. So anyway, but it can also be an absolutely incredible, amazing journey in the same way that psychedelics or other deep practices can be. And it does insight and healing and trauma and jhanas and magic and realms and all kinds of archetypal stuff and deep, strange things that are hard to classify in some people sometimes. And it's weirdly unpredictable as well what you're going to get. I've done 11 retreats of this so far. They've all been similar in some ways and very different in others. So it's something of a rolling some very interesting dice. And just so everybody has a sense of at least the basics of informed consent for this. And so, but yeah, like I was on a retreat one time, and all of a sudden I found myself in this extremely different space, and there was the fire goddess, and the fire goddess screamed at me, "Become a king of fire!" And I snapped back, and all of a sudden I was like, what the hell? And it felt as real as this. It just had a slightly cartoon-like element, but it was a fully three-dimensional, embodied, living, very loud experience. And it was like, whoa, very sort of psychologically shocking, and like, what the heck does that mean? Become a king of fire? It sounds ridiculous, right? But yeah, maybe there's something there. I don't know. So, and we can have these experiences, and I've had lots of others. That's just the one I tend to talk about because it's sort of dramatic and interesting. I've had less dramatic, just stranger ones. But then how do we interpret that? And do we do something functional with that, or run screaming from the room, or suddenly like light ourselves on fire, or whatever terrible thing you might think to do, right? Obviously my definition of mental health is very much in terms of function and outcomes. right? So this is something I've talked about on some other podcasts before, and that's why I hold my ontological frame around that experience lightly. Did the experience, occur so far as I can tell, unless my memory is fallible, which it might be, who knows? Sort of demon experiment, these demon questions of like, are we being, fed fake memories or something to create a reality? I don't know. But those kinds of questions aside, the sense of what do you make of that? Is there a real fire goddess? Some part of me reacted psychologically as if there really was. Was there a real command in some important mission I'm supposed to go on? Oh, yeah, maybe, I don't know. But like, there's a part of me that's like, ooh, wouldn't that be cool? Or, oh, that would be terrifying. Or, oh, no, it's just totally crazy. And so what I end up also noticing is like from an internal family systems point of view, like parts, we generally have all these parts of ourselves that are going to weigh in on what an experience was or is, or the possible interpretations. And I think it's when we lose some of that frame, we have a little bit of risk of things going sideways. If you don't have an internal skeptic, okay, just realize sometimes there could be a useful one if we don't have an internal critic, if we don't have an internal something. And I realize that in some people, those can get totally out of balance and way out of proportion and just cause all kinds of chaos. But yet some part of them might be useful for navigating the world in the face of the strange. Right. So I've had a super lot of strange experiences, a lot of entity encountery sorts of experiences. And Fire Kasina can get full on. Like I saw a recent thing, I was reading a blog and it was like, meditation has the advantage of being sustainable and doesn't produce deep end experiences. And psychedelics have the advantage of being like producing deep end experiences, but you can't really live there. And how do you integrate them and whatever? Now, this is a meditation that can produce experiences that are as powerful as anything you're going to take on a psychedelic. And people are like, oh, then you haven't taken a powerful psychedelic. I'm like, actually, no, I super have. And no, like as powerful. And my, friends who have done, 100 times more psychedelic stuff than me, and at even much higher doses and across a broader range, who have done Fire Kasina also go, yes, it can produce super powerful experiences if you get the dose high. And what's high dose? 8 to 16 hours a day for 2 to 3 weeks. That's kind of what we think of as like the high dose range. Maybe 18 hours a day if you really want to push it. I wouldn't go past 20. You're not going to get enough sleep. And that can just make people totally flip out. So, but yeah, that's high dose. And I, there was someone I was helping with a retreat who about day 12 started saying, okay, I'm now walking around with something that is as vividly powerful as the most powerful DMT stuff I've smoked in terms of hyperdimensional, multifractal, ultra vivid, crystalline, shifting, organic, cosmically integrated, stuff I'm seeing. And she's like walking down my driveway talking to me, and so it also does this in this sort of very weird integrated kind of way. And you can also have full like other realm, totally blown out from this reality experiences too. But just Fire Kasina and that kind of related range of techniques is another one of the things that can get people into this kind of territory and precipitate super wild, powerful experiences. Just again, not safe. So,
right. And so my impression is that I think it was a Michael Taft's podcast. You said that these experiences caused you to drop your kind of scientific worldview. Is that still where you stand?
They can definitely. So to drop a scientific worldview is funny. Like I pick up and take off the scientific worldview as I need to. And what even is or am, as Gordon White might say, the scientific worldview? What is that really? Because strangely enough, materialism says this is all a simulation in a brain somewhere. None of this is the actual experience, right? So that's a funny conclusion for materialists to say that all of this is a hyper-processed, filtered, clearly kind of worked over, selectively interpreted thing, from a reality that we have never directly experienced, because there is no red, there's just photons with a certain wavelength. There is no warm or cold. There's just atoms with a certain average, kinetic energy or randomness or something. And so they would say that our entire reality is actually this constructed, filtered, whatever thing. Well, okay, wait a second. That's actually kind of what these experiences will show you, that you can get to levels where literally any aspect of your experience is totally manipulable and up for grabs by merely intending to change it however you want. It's a phase we call malleable and wieldy. And so is that compatible with science? What does that even mean? And depends on your scientific interpretation of materialism and what experience is, right? But it certainly opened me up to some things I had not seriously considered in that kind of way. And it was the collective magical experiences where I was so what shifted me that I was trying to point to is like when two people are seeing the same weird magical thing and can comment on it and interact with it, like that is where my previous models of reality got shifted to include other possibilities that are way more interdependently, connectedly conscious rather than individual people creating their own solipsistic worldviews.
Right.
Necessarily, I don't know.
Yeah,
So
this is
expanded
really
out my
useful.
palette of ontologies, which is slightly different from dropping my scientific
Right.
frame. Does
So
that make sense?
it does. But when I say scientific worldview, I definitely don't mean, the stuff we spoke about before, reification of kind of, subatomic particles, reductionism, all that stuff. I guess I mainly mean exactly what you said. Actually, the appreciation that our experiences are kind of generated from within. When I'm seeing the color red, it's kind of the way that the organism consciousness and the brain seem to work is to conjure that, to fabricate that. It doesn't really exist out there on the surface. It's kind of arising in relationship. And
Or you could
that,
look at it from the empirical frame, the total reverse. This is the real thing, and we extrapolate particles and forces and energies from this experiential frame, right? As like
right.
David Humean.
But so with, I guess the core thing is for me would be naturalism, where you say that everything that exists should, our understanding of it should be coherent. There shouldn't be any fundamental ruptures. To me, that's the commitment to naturalism. If you think levitation can happen as a kind of mental thing where you physically cause the body to rise, to me that's a rupture in our naturalistic frame. So we need new. If that's true, to naturalize that, we would need new laws. We would need to kind of reframe stuff. So I think to get kind of to pin this down, the joint experiences are really useful because we spoke about how convincing subjective experiences can be, and in the joint experience, if you had a third party observer where each person could report, one person reports secretly to the scientist what it is they're conjuring, the other person reports what they're seeing, that would remove the sociological, the fact that if you spent time on retreat with someone, there could be an interdependent kind of arising of this experience, but it's because you've spent all this time together, you've been talking about things, they actually intuit that really you're in a headspace where you're going to imagine an orange mandala, and they may not even realize why, because it came up weeks ago. We definitely know that kind of stuff happens, and so the attribution of there is some causality here that is linking our minds in a way that science doesn't currently appreciate. To modify our metaphysics in that way, there would need to be some empirical evidence that, which is just to say, being firm about the reason that your joint experience was caused you to expand your kind of worldview, presumably is because it seemed
As the range
to,
of possible interesting ontologies that I
right.
was more willing to entertain.
Right. But so
Which is
their report of seeing the same thing was data, right? So all we're talking about is doing an experiment is formalizing that, being more rigorous than just anecdotal report. And so to me, I always come back to having had these really convincing experiences that seem to not fit with scientific worldview. I always come back to a sense of like, the sci literature just hasn't shown things to me that are rigorously, and that could be a sociological phenomenon where scientists are actually, there is the data and the mainstream scientists don't want to let it in. I don't know. I haven't spent any time kind of looking at that stuff. But so
you should
to
check
me,
out
it's
Real
really...
Magic by Dean Radin, The End of Materialism by Charles Tart. These are fascinating and interesting reads, and think
Right.
about the arguments. And but from a sort of a realmian point of view, like realms are interesting in that, like, as soon as you sort of adopt realms as an interesting way of parsing your frames, then one of the definitions of this realm is it's the one I can't fly in, whereas I seem to be able to fly in most or all of the others, and this seems to be the singular exception.
That's funny.
So
That's like the
and
Humean
so
thing. Yeah.
yeah, so that's like,
Yeah.
you
So you're
know
putting the experience first, and then yeah, that's interesting. But so I think the if I'm honest, I'm not going to read the books because I'm I'm not, I'm willing, nothing for me actually hinges on whether realms are real or this kind of stuff. You know, if I go there when I die, I'll go there when I die. It's interesting. It's fun to drop into DMT world, but like, I'm more excited about, you know, there's a research project at the moment trying to use AI to talk to whales. To me, that's a more interesting alien encounter than chatting with the DMT entities. Maybe the DMT entities, if they were real, more powerful, more consequential for my life. But so for me personally, I'm not. If in 100 years we've figured all this out and actually it's mainstream science, fine. But
That
that's not
would
where my
amaze
attention
me,
is.
but I like it.
Right?
I like the
but
possibility.
but so I guess what I'm getting at is this is partly why the non-dual framing I find to be a kind of it stands apart from every other framing, and because it's so you almost can't say anything about it because it's just what I'm reaching for is just this sense of isness. What exists of itself, and there is no to say or think anything about to conceptualize it is an additional thing. Everything just is. So even if these realms are real, they just are. And so I feel like that's the ultimate thing to come back to, that this is, it's all fun, you know, like it's fun to, it's a lot of fun to talk to you right now, but this is not it. Well, it simultaneously is it at the same time, right? We are just existing right here. So it's the non-dual framing feels like
We are just
right
occurring.
there you go, occurring. But yeah. And so I do you think that I may be overly attached to a particular frame, and that actually you can't say that the non-dual frame is somehow more ultimate, deeper, more fundamental than all these other frames?
Well, I don't know how you would say more ultimate, deeper, more fundamental. What I can say is that of the two perceptual interpretive modes, like there's before April of 2003 and after April of 2003, this mode better lines up with my understanding of science experience and just feels vastly better, right? So regardless of truer, this is clearly better. Like I would not not want to go back to the previous interpretive perceptual mode at all. Like, so this to me was worth it because it feels more clear. It feels more compellingly explanatory. That doesn't mean it is. So rather than necessarily give it ontological status, I can say that clinically or personally, this is just vastly preferable, right? And also has the sense of, okay, it also has the sense of answering deep questions I was asking. Every moment now is straightforwardly the answer to the question of insight practice for me. Whereas before there seemed to be a question and a problem that needed to be solved. Now every moment seems like the answer. That is much nicer. And then the other thing I'm going to bring back in is the point of view of the EPRC, which is the clinical perspective. So, for example, and this is the example I use all the time, but it's a really good one. When I saw migraine patients and they came to me and said, oh, I've got this pain in my head, I'm nauseous, been lying in the dark for 2 days, and I'm seeing these white wiggly lines, I never asked the question if the white wiggly lines were an emergent property of insensate particles or forces, or whether the white, wiggly lines were a simulation, or whether they're the mind of God or a manifestation of cosmic eternal consciousness. I never asked that question at all. I was like, oh, white wiggly lines, pathognomonic for migraine, don't need to get a head CT, can treat them as a migraine and add value to their life and help normalize the experience of what's going on with them, and say, some people see white wiggly lines with migraines. This is a known thing. It doesn't mean you're crazy. Don't have to call it a hallucination or a psychosis. It's not helpful, I think, in fact, to do those. And instead, you can just say, hey, what adds value to this person's life today? And that sort of phenomenological, pragmatic, how do we help you relate to this experience in a way that leads to good outcomes that you feel are good outcomes, and help as a practitioner or patient or consciousness explorer or accidental experience or whatever. And how can we facilitate the known benefits of some of these experiences if there are potentials to really enhance your life from them? And how can we mitigate some of the challenges? That's actually that really rubber meets the road, non-theoretical, not getting lost in the endless ontology wars, but just actually like what helps humans here today. That frame, for me, is the most compelling right now. And so that's why I pour my time into that. because the other ontological debates are fascinating, but they're also endless. Whereas the clear potential to help people in a better way that is beyond just crazy needs meds or doesn't exist is very compelling to me. And so regardless of ultimate truth, that's what I find and what the team finds called to at the moment.
Right. No, I completely agree with that. And it's amazing how robust that compassion is that arises from the seeing through of concepts, that it's just, that is the current that catches you, and it's just, you don't need convincing that helping people to feel better is the right thing to do.
Yeah, I wake up at 6 or something every morning thinking about how to do that,
Right.
and that's what I go to bed thinking about, and it's just totally caught me, and so that's what I spend my life working on now, and have a great bunch of and a community aligned around this very same compelling, useful vision, we think.
Right. And with the kind of pragmatic use of the weirder end of the spectrum stuff to help people improve their well-being, you know, it may seem, I'm interested in what your take is there on the connection, or if there even is a connection, if this is just interesting stuff to explore after you've already kind of woken up to a certain level of well-being. To me, it's interesting that I think this Fire Kasina practice predates Buddhism, right? It's kind of linked to more kind of ancient shamanistic traditions, and with shamanism, I mean, that seems to me very much tied up with helping people. I mean, this is what we see with psychedelic medicine. I think it's a modern form of shamanism where you're helping people get into archetypal headspaces to work through how they are connected to other things in reality.
Certainly one way to interpret it.
What's your take?
Well, I mean,
takes, I should say, your multiple frames on how it can be useful for people.
Wow. Okay. So I have a lot of different frames on this. I mean, clearly there are people who find profound healing on psychedelics, right? And have for millennia. And then is what we're doing modern shamanism? Well, you've got to be all kinds of careful with the term shamanism. And is this like, are we co-opting something from Siberia? But ignoring that aside and using the pop definition without questions of sort of cultural appropriation, sort of throwing out all those important arguments and discussions and the anthropology of that. And then recognizing that we're actually talking about a diverse range of traditions. So that's the next thing. This isn't just one tradition. There's a lot of different traditions and how they relate to psychedelics in their own interpretive frames, though you do find a lot of common themes emerging. And it also kind of depends on the psychedelic. They're not all quite the same. They tend to predispose more or less to certain types of experiences, though there can be a lot of overlap. So that thing. And then is what we're doing clinically now the equivalent? Well, that's a sort of a complicated thing. So I was just talking with a guy named Hamilton who runs Blue Morpho, which is a center that does ayahuasca and other modalities, but that's one of theirs. I shouldn't, I'm a novice when qualifying these things, so I should be careful here. And is what we're doing in the West what they're doing, or the traditional people are doing? Well, what the traditional people he was describing to me do, actually, they spend tons and tons of time in the space themselves over a decade or two until they can very reproducibly enter this territory, enter into the experience with the other person reproducibly, get a sense of what's going on, modulate that with a high degree of intent and control and organic interactivity with not only their own psychedelic experience, but the other person's psychedelic experience in some way that is very precisely diagnostic and then prescribedly therapeutic. Like, is that what we're doing in the West? I don't know that that's what we're actually doing, right? Maybe a few people are doing psychedelics a few times, taking a little course, reading a few journal articles, and then, hand holding in a space with some nice music headphones in a hospital bed, and talking people through their experience and helping provide some basic breathing and grounding techniques. Do those sound like the same thing? I don't know. But is it in the, so if the broad category of, is it kind of what we're doing? Well, yeah, but we have to be a little bit ontologically and maybe methodologically humble and say, we have to be very careful with these kinds of equivalences and just have a little bit of caution and go, yeah, okay, so do you see what I mean?
No, I love that. I mean, I was very much gesturing in a direction, and you really ran with it in a great way there. Yeah, and to be more precise, I guess what I'm saying is that when I'm talking about shamanism, I'm using it in the way anthropologists do as to point towards what seems to be a common heritage in many cultures, that varies certainly, but has this common thing of inwardly kind of having some kind of visionary journey where there is some kind of connection to the world beyond socially, to nature, these kind of archetypal themes, that is guided in some way, often to help you come to some insight, whether it's around lost objects is a very common thing, right, in kind of traditional shamanism. But today we very much usually think about it in terms of mental health and, soul retrieval, these kinds of things. And
trauma healing, PTSD,
yeah,
anxiety, depression.
Exactly. So I think you're totally right that when a pharma company wants to give someone a newly developed psychedelic that doesn't have the trip, and they want to get them out of the office as quickly as possible, and someone's just going to sit there with them, I don't think that is the same thing. But I guess what I'm saying is,
I mean, it might be really cool for people. I don't mean to criticize it either. I think some of that can really help people. I have friends who have been part of these studies and these kinds of experiences, and that it was really meaningful and profound and transformative. So sometimes it is. Okay, cool. Right.
Yeah.
But
I appreciate you pointing towards the complexity there, because I guess what I'm gesturing towards is that I think there's no other parallel in Western culture for, I do see a parallel between, I mean, clearly ayahuasca, is a living example of these kinds of traditions. And so we're in the same kind of space, I guess. But what I was really specifically asking is, when it comes to things like deity encounters, entities, all the weird stuff with the Fire Kasina and also with psychedelics, do you see that and this task of kind of, or the self-assigned kind of aim of trying to help people to come into more well-being or liberation, or whatever words you want to use, are they a sideshow? Are they useful? I point to shamanism as a way that you could talk about kind of energetically people coming into insights, this kind of stuff. That's why I brought that in here. But that's just my own kind of thinking. So yeah, what's your thinking about the usefulness of the kind of weirder end of the spectrum?
Wow. So I actually am going to revert to a very early frame that I ran into when I read The Spectrum of Consciousness, which is Ken Wilber's first major thing, which he wrote when he was quite young. And he would call it Wilbur 1. And then he said, oh, the stuff I did later was better. I actually think some of his early stuff is actually pretty cool, weirdly enough. And so, waxing Wilberian for just a moment, and this is something I could talk endlessly about, but we don't have a lot of time left, I don't think. But just to sort of say, I have this model where if in like band 1, you've got angels and archangels and gods and demons and devils and fairies and pixies and trolls and sprites and water spirits and nature spirits and elementals and God knows, this, right? And band 2, you have God, yourself, devil. And then band 3, egoic, you have super ego, id, and you're the poor schmo in the middle trying to figure these things out. And band 4, existential, you have the cutting power of reason to dissect reality, and the split is between the mind and body. And band 5, yogic, there's like this mind body system integration, and the split is between you and the world. And then band 6, and this is slightly modified, it's not perfectly Wilberian either, but close. And then band 6, they call it this is the one where like we're all in this together, and collective Gaia hypothesis, and we're all part of a unitive dynamic system, right? And then if band 7 is like void and experience oscillating back and forth, right? Each of these bands have their shadow sides and their opportunities and their problems and their limits. Each of them are part of the range of human experience. My goal as a practitioner for myself, and I wouldn't necessarily put this burden on anybody, is to have explored each of those on their own terms, as living human part of the spectrum of consciousness, and then have spent a lot of time thinking about how they can skillfully relate to each other, like how the band 4 existential analytical, which is a lot of what we're doing here, can relate to deep end experiences of band 1, which would be entities and energies and forces and all of that complexity, right? Which is some of that question. And then how we can maybe do something useful in the world with it, which is kind of a band 6, we're all in this together. And then how we can integrate it into mind-body healing, which is kind of band 5, and how we can deal with the orthodox religions, which is like God, them and devil, and how they relate to this. And then how we can just get our ordinary human needs met as sort of band 3 schmoes trying to navigate in the world between our ideals and our drives. And then how we can see that all as the natural play of emptiness and manifestation mingling back and forth in this immediate transient present moment, which is very band 7. And so like I that's my kind of big overarching frame. I could talk a long time about that, but that's kind of how I relate to those kinds of questions.
That's a great summary, and it really brings us full circle to we began talking about using different frames, and after fleshing out all those different frames, it would be funny if you were like, no, I'll pick this one. I'll forget the other ones. This is my favorite one. This one's more fun than the others. Yeah, and so I mean, I feel like that was actually a good answer with the potential to then spark another 2-hour conversation, which maybe we should save for a follow up if you're up for that, as I do have to get going.
That'd be tremendous fun.
Yeah, this has been really, really great. Thank you, Daniel. Where would you send people to if you want to look into your work more?
Oh, cool. You could find me. The EPRC is the thing I care the most about in emergence benefactors these days. So theeprc.org is the big team that I'm just a small part of. And we're trying to make this vision of upgrading the scientific and clinical and public understandings and public health understandings of the deep end using high quality methods with a really pragmatic outcome-based focus and thinking about what scales globally and what is ethical. So that's the EPRC. Please find that. Help us out. Thank you. Emergence Benefactors is the charity to support that. You can find us at ebenefactors.org. Fire Kasina, which I mentioned, FIREKASINA.org. You can find this book, which I mentioned, which is very much like, like when I'm in like my sort of Buddhist-y kind of mode, right? That's at mctb.org. Mastering the Core Teachings of the Buddha, so mctb.org. And then my personal website, where the things I find interesting these days are philanthropy and some stuff like that, as well as my Twitter feed and stuff. You can find at integrateddaniel.info. So integrateddaniel.info is where you could find more information on that part of the thing. Thanks. This has been really delightful and super appreciative of a fun conversation, you sharing the journey and your perspectives.
Yeah, thank you. No, this has been really, really good. Thanks again. Thanks for listening. If you're watching on YouTube, please like and subscribe. And if you want to help the podcast reach a wider audience, you can leave a review on Apple Podcasts. Finally, if you want to offer financial support, you can go to patreon.com/Dr. James Cook.